So, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. And tonight we're going to be looking at opportunities to get on the board within the NHS. So, my name is Pete Little. I'm part of the business development team at the Officers Association. But it's not really about me tonight. Tonight is actually about looking at these non-executive roles within the NHS. So, tonight we're going to cover off quite a bit. First off, looking at all about the NHS, just a bit of an overview for you, and then really into the nitty-gritty of what a board looks like within the NHS, the role of the non-executive director, why you would maybe want to consider becoming a non-executive director, and then importantly, what are the options of actually getting involved and joining some of the schemes to prepare you to become a non-exec with the NHS. And then, as I said, at the end we'll cover off some questions and discussion. So it's a real privilege tonight to be joined by Janice and Dusty, who will just give us a brief introduction of themselves. So Janice, good evening.
Hi Peter. My name is Janice Scanlan. I'm Head of Non-Executive Development for an organisation called NHS Improvement. Our role is to help the NHS to improve, as they say, as it says in the tin. I've got over 25 years excuse me, experience of working with chairs and non-executive directors, primarily in the private sector, but obviously spending a lot of time working in the NHS, as you can see from my profile there.
Great, thanks for that, Janice. And maybe Dusty, could we have a little bit of your background, please?
Peter, thank you. My early part of my career was spent in the Royal Air Force for about 27 or so years. I left the service in 2006-7. I spent a couple of years then working in the Home Office before moving into the Cabinet Office for another 2 or 3 years. And in 2011, I moved across into higher education as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of East London. It was there that I first became connected with NHS Improvement, as it now is today, and took on my first non-executive role in a London trust. And I've since left both that role to take on the role as chair of North Middlesex, and I've also left the university after 6 years of being the Deputy Vice-Chancellor there to take on the role of Chief Operating Officer at VFS Global. So mine is more of a mixed bag of experiences than Janice describes, but the great thread through all of that has been public service.
Okay, thanks for that, Dusty, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. So if we could kick off tonight by just looking at what is this thing we call the National Health Service, and Janice, could you maybe just give us a brief overview of just how large and complex this organisation actually is?
Yeah, of course, Peter. I don't want to cause concern to the people joining us, because I'm not going to run you through the NHS. I'm certainly not going to test you on the structure of the NHS, because as you can see from this slide, and this is the simplest slide I could find that kind of explains it is a complex structure, and the relationship between the various parts of the system are many and varied. I did want to share this slide with you so you could see where NHS Improvement, which ironically sits in the middle of that slide, sits within the whole structure, and you can see there's a direct relationship between the box underneath called providers. Now, providers are all of those organisations that you will be familiar with in terms of the care that they provide to you and your family within the NHS. They are secondary care providers, so this is not about the GP services that you access. This is about the secondary care providers. Generally, they are acute hospitals, so all the hospital sites are secondary care providers. There are a number of community care providers as well that are providing services out in the community, in people's homes and in smaller units. There are mental health specialist mental health service providers, and there are ambulance service providers. So they're the main categories of providers that we have a relationship. And obviously Dusty's joined us today. He's chair of one of those providers, that we work with on a regular basis. So our relationship, NHS Improvement's relationship, is as a sector regulator, as is described on that chart. But we've also moved further into that whole area of support for the provider sector. So it's not just that regulation; it's also about providing support to help the sector improve.
Okay, and just thinking about the complexity, also the scale of it, and you've got some numbers for us about the NHS here, just to give a sense of that scale of the organisation as a whole, but also the trust themselves. So maybe you could just talk us through those, please.
Yeah. So obviously the NHS is a huge organisation, though in reality it's made up of multiple smaller organisations. But I think it's something like the largest employer in Europe, or something of that scale. So we are talking about an awful lot of public money that's spent in the NHS. We obviously are a huge employer, which is a very important responsibility for the NHS. And obviously we have a great responsibility for the health and welfare of our community. As described there are those providers I talked about earlier. There are 232 of them across the country, and they are very locally, and they are very much generally a very local service provider. So I live in Harrogate in North Yorkshire, so Harrogate Healthcare is very much at the heart of the community that I live in, and provides a range of important services within that area. The range, so within those 232 providers I've mentioned, there's a huge range in terms of size and complexity. The largest trust we've got in the country is the new Manchester University Hospitals. I don't know if any of the people joined us are actually from that neck of the woods, but it's a new acute provider that's been formed as the merger of two slightly smaller trusts. But it's got a turnover of £1.4 billion a year, which is a huge amount of public money. Now, I realise it's not all about money. It's certainly not all about money. It's about patients, but it does give you an idea. It's of the size and the complexity of these organisations and the level of responsibility they have. But just so that you don't think that they're all about that kind of level of complexity. There are smaller organisations, and the smallest one we've got is at the other end of the scale, with a 45 million turnover. That's a Tavistock and Portman, which is a specialist mental health service provider in London. And obviously the rest of the 230 organisations fit somewhere within that range of turnover.
Thank you for that, Janice. And we're really lucky today to have Dusty joining us, who's the chair of North Middlesex Hospitals. So, Dusty, if you could maybe bring those numbers to life, and with your experience of working with North Middlesex Hospitals, and giving us a flavour of what it is to chair one of these trusts, please.
Thank you. I think the first thing I'd say about numbers is that numbers can sometimes be misleading. I think for this particular audience, the way that I would characterise running a hospital trust, and when I say running it, I don't mean from the perspective necessarily of the chair, but simply the senior team that run an NHS trust are in many ways analogous to the senior team that run a large military garrison, an RAF station, or a Type 42 or whatever else at sea. They are complex organisations. There's a significant set of challenges around delivering operational capability. There's a very significant challenge around the infrastructure that one has to deliver that capability. The corollary to that clearly is that there are some significant financial constraints that tie our hands at sometimes particularly awkward times, and now is a very awkward time of the year as we approach the winter season and the time of the year when our acute hospitals particularly, and North Middlesex is an acute hospital, are running at 110% capacity. So there is something which I have certainly, over two very different types of trusts now in London, have found, as I say, interestingly and curiously analogous to my memories of running large military organisations. The North Middlesex that I trust trust that I chair at the moment is one of the largest acute hospitals. It serves a significant proportion of our community in the north of London. But what this slide doesn't tell you, and what is so important when understanding the function of trusts, is the demography and type of community that you serve. And what this slide doesn't share with you is the fact that there is a very, very significant Turkish community in the part of London that this hospital is based. And what lies behind that observation is that, you know, like many other people from different parts of the world to our own, they operate in societies and within cultural norms which are very different to ours. So quite often with our patient population, the mother in the family or the eldest daughter in the family actually takes on the responsibility of what we would do if we went to see a general practitioner. They act as that first primary source of care to those people in their families. What that means for us in a large trust is that whereas we're established to have about 300 to 350 emergency presentations at A&E on a daily basis, we are quite often at the 500 mark, and we often breach the 600 and 650 mark, because those patients that are coming to see us have, in their own way, and for not for benevolent reasons, but they've circumvented the primary health system and simply presented at our door. So what lies behind all of that is the observation, which we'll come to later on one of the slides, about intelligence and understanding the community that we serve, understanding the particular patient needs of that community, and not trying to be evangelical and to try to change those cultural ways of living and operating, but actually to be responding positively to them and changing for ourselves the way that our patient population seek and wish to be treated. So it's contextually, that's really, really important. And when I was in the east of London at Barking-Havering Redbridge University Trust, we had a very, very different demography to the one we have in the north of London. Yet in travelling time, it's only 20 or 25 minutes away. Apart from the A&E, our hospital is a fully fledged acute hospital which provides all of the facilities in terms of operating theatres, inpatient and outpatient services that you might expect. Some 800 to 900 people flow in and out of the door every single day. And then on top of the usual, what you call routine in and outpatient clinics, we have a range of specialist services, perhaps best known in our area for the HIV and AIDS services that we provide, and the thalassemia and sickle cell departments, which are very well recognised across the country as being centres of excellence for those particular diseases. I think my concluding thought on this slide, and please do come back and test some of this in your questions, is that when it comes to the question, what kind of NED do I look for, and have I just been looking for, because I've just been out to recruit 2 of them through the summer months to join my board, what are the qualities, what are the skills and competencies that I search and seek most for? They are the qualities around understanding how to deal with large operations, how to deal with complexity, and also how to deal with flow. Because the biggest single problem we have is created by flow and the bottlenecks at the front of the hospital, which I briefly touched on, but also the bottleneck at the back of the hospital, because we are required to treat patients within a constitutional standard, which is 4 hours from the time that they first present. And quite often, the outcome of our treatment is to admit them as inpatients into the hospital. But you can only do that if you have enough beds to admit the patient. And at any one time at the North Middlesex Hospital, we have between 40 and 70 to 75 people who are fully fit and able to go home, but they simply have nowhere to go home to because of the frailties of the systems that adjoin the acute medicine systems in terms of social care and care of the elderly and the provision of step-down housing. So I could actually, I could characterise this as being a bottle with two ends, both of which can create and have created unnatural bottlenecks to them. And it's understanding how all of those systems interact both internally and how they act with the external environment that you need to have the insight into so that you can question, challenge, and help, assist, and mentor the executive team in meeting some of the challenges that these kinds of issues present on a day-to-day basis. And even now, as we're having this conversation, as we approach 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, there will be tens and scores of people coming through the door who are people that we need to be managing as if they were individuals, not as if they were 100 people at a time. Absolutely. So I hope that just provides a little bit of light and a little bit of colour to the type of issues and introduces the notion of the type of people that we're looking to have at the board table, Peter, when it comes to acute trust like ours.
Yes, absolutely. And just thinking about that context side and the actual function of the board there, you have a really useful summary chart taken from the Leadership Academy here that you could maybe just outline exactly what an NHS board looks like and actually does. Could you maybe just talk through this summary side, please?
I will. And Peter, as you know, the slide that follows, in a sense, is a little bit more helpful because it takes these headlines and actually expands them slightly more. So
should we move on to that one then for the details?
I think so, because I think it might just help those that are listening to me.
Agreed. Okay. So here we are in a tabular form.
And I would just say that as you've alluded, Peter, in the sense this isn't a slide I've created, and I don't seem to distance myself from detail, but I would say that, you know, from my point of view anyway, there are one or two very small things here which I wouldn't quite see as it's drafted. So formulating strategy is absolutely right. You know, it is my responsibility as chair, and certainly the responsibility of my non-executives, to ensure that the trust has a long-term sustainable strategy which addresses all those things that I talked about in terms of our patient and community needs, but also addresses the interfaces with all of the many stakeholders that we have across the councils that we serve. But it's not. But formulating strategy is an exercise which one can do slightly in a bit of a bubble, perhaps. The real challenge for the board. And the non-executive side of the board, I hasten to add, is in that next line around accountability. And it's here on that very first sub-bullet that I would just slightly challenge, because I think it goes beyond, in fact, I think it goes well beyond holding the executive to account for just the delivery of strategy, because as military people would probably recognise more quickly than most, we don't deliver strategy of itself. Strategy is a long-term game. We're talking about delivery of the day-to-day operation of an acute medical hospital, and holding the executive to account is really very important. And it's important because the instinct of all of us is to get the job done, but there are times when getting the job done doesn't serve the best long-term interests of a hospital or a trust. And I'll give you one example of that, if I may, which is a brief one, which is simply that, and it goes back to when I was a non-executive at another trust. I was chairing, as the non-executives do, and I did yesterday at North Middlesex, a consultant appointment board, where there were only 2 consultants on the shortlist. We interviewed them both. And there was a huge push and a lot of pressure from the chief executive, the medical director, and 1 or 2 others who were on the panel to make an appointment of one of these 2 people who were in front of us that day. But the reality was that neither of them really were at the level that our trust at the time needed in terms of the leadership of the future, the clinical leadership of the future, which is what the consultant level role should be providing us with. And so you have this tension between getting the job done and the need for the executive to fill a vacant post, which they were desperate to do, and my own view of that, which was that we couldn't just appoint anybody. They had to be at a level which was commensurate with what our needs were in the longer term. And that holding to account and that holding the hand on the shoulder sometimes is the key to NEDs discharging their responsibilities effectively. A lot of the rest of it, if I were to go down that list around constructive challenge, is absolutely right. And many people use the term critical friend. I have my own term for this, actually. I talk about inquisitive collegiality. My phrase for the perfect non-executive is a non-executive who's an inquisitive collegial person. In other words, somebody who's constantly probing and searching and asking the right questions, but never doing so in a way which leaves the person who he's talking to or talking about feeling bruised by that constructive challenge. Participation in committees, all of the committees and most non-executives either chair or attend committees, and most trusts have the same committee structures. There's a committee around quality and safety of clinical and patient care, which is in my view, the preeminent and most important thing that we do, holding safe and providing high quality care to patients. There's another committee around finance, there's another committee around audit. All trusts have a nominations and remuneration committee, and most trusts, although not all trusts, have got a committee that lends itself to the sort of people and HR agendas. And the non-execs are very much at the forefront of driving those committees which are serviced by the executive. The shaping of culture, in a sense, the shaping of culture goes back to the example I gave about the appointment of that consultant. It's about, through everything that we do and everything that we say and write, it's about showing where the lines in the sand are and where we're prepared to accept behaviours and outcomes and understand the mitigation without being too harsh and calling it excuses, and where we're not. And I think that's really, really important, actually shaping culture, because a lot of the issues in the limited experience I've had in the last 5 years in the health service have been issues which have their seeds rooted in cultural norms which have been acquired, and we're now having to try to disabuse people of acting in those ways. I think there's another really important word in that middle box around shaping culture, which almost, I think, should be on the left-hand side in that board role column, and it's the word visible. The effective non-executive in an acute hospital is a visible non-executive, someone who is seen and recognised, someone who walks the floors and provides a sounding board for whomsoever, whether it's a patient or a member of staff or a contractor who supports the trust, to raise concerns, to talk and to have conversations. It's a vitally important part of the role.
Do you think that that's where a former officer can really add value in this area, bringing that visible leadership to a trust?
I totally do, Peter, but I kind of, there's a part of me that, and I don't want to say it in so many words, but there's a part of me that suggests that almost all of the qualities that all of the people that are dialing in who spent time in the armed services, in the commissioned or indeed in the non-commissioned ranks as well, to an extent, the qualities and the standards and the visibility and the understanding of what leadership is in the context that we lived leadership in that world. I think all of those are massively transferable qualities. They're much more transferable than those people who are still wearing uniform would ever imagine them to be.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that.
I'll just quickly skip to intelligence because it's something really important about that. This is the sort of the meat and potatoes of understanding, and there is no substitute for understanding, which is why there's no substitute for being in the hospital and walking around the wards and talking to nurses and understanding how pressure points are created and what the palliatives are to those pressures that the hospital systems are facing on a day-to-day basis. And there is no other way of understanding that than having that first-hand knowledge. So there's an awful lot of walking the floor, which again is something which most officers, going back to the time that they commanded squadrons and platoons and companies, will know that spending time with your men and women is a critical element of the role for which there can be no substitute. And then I'll just jump down to engagement at the bottom. I mean, clearly the board and the non-execs ensure that we act in the best interests of our patients and public. And then just to explain, if it's necessary, that senior independent director is somebody that the board appoints. It's not an appointment made by me as a chair or NHSI. The board look around the table once a year or so, and they appoint somebody who they, as a board, as individuals, or collectively as a board, can go to if they feel that there is something going on, principally with the way that the chair is performing or acting or behaving, and there's a route. It's a kind of internal, in a sense, internal boardroom whistleblowing scheme, but it's one that all chairs hope has never needs to be used. But it is something which is there as part of the Constitution and part of the way that we manage our business most effectively. So I thought it was helpful to talk around this slide more so than the last, because some of these words are quite important on here, Peter.
No, I agree, Dusty. Thank you for that. I'm just thinking about the responsibilities and how that actually translates into a role. Maybe we can move on to the next slide of exactly what is a non-executive director within the NHS. And I'm not sure that, Janice, do you want to just work through this of exactly what this is within a trust, please?
So having got you all fired up and keen to get involved in the NHS, I can now kind of talk you through the kind of the context for the non-exec. So I mentioned earlier that these providers, that these 232 providers that we talked about earlier, and Dusty's reinforced that by demonstrating his knowledge of his own community. They're very much drawn from the local community because they are providing services for the local community. Each board has a non-executive team, obviously led by the non-executive chair like Dusty, but there are generally around between 5 and 7 non-executive directors on the board. That is very much a team made up of different individuals with different skills, experience and qualities. The last thing Dusty needs on his board is 5 or 7 accountants, for example. He wants a mix of people with a different range of skills and experience, so he's got the broadest experience from which to draw from his non-executive team. So you'll see there some of the some examples of the sorts of things we're looking for. Generally on a board there will be someone with a finance background. Obviously the numbers I gave you earlier in terms of the amount of money the NHS is spending every year explains why there needs to be somebody with a finance background there, not least to chair the audit committee. Dusty mentioned clinical governance and quality assurance. It's important there's somebody who can actually help hold the clinical team to account. So you'll find on a board someone with a clinical background. So that's kind of 2 of the 7, if you like. The rest of the 5 will be a range of people with different skills, experience. Some will just be a general kind of governance skills, or it might be something specific to help the trust address particular challenges it faces at that particular time. So in the next bullet, I've identified some of the particular sets of skills that some chairs have asked for, just to reflect the particular issues that trust is dealing with. It might be a long-term requirement. Often it's just a short-term requirement while that organisation addresses a particular issue. Logistics is something that comes up particularly with the ambulance trust for reasons I'm sure you'll understand, but it obviously affects other big trusts in different ways. Non-executive roles are always for a fixed term. They are generally for between 2 and 3 years, or they can be for 4 years, but they are often extended beyond that. Non-executives can be reappointed for a longer period of time. But this fixed term, the nature of this fixed term appointment does mean that there's constant churn in the non-executive team, which is a good thing, because one of the things that Dusty highlighted in his earlier slide was the external perspective that non-execs bring to the work of the trust, and to make sure that that's constantly refreshed is an important part of the non-executive role. In terms of getting involved, what that means, the time commitment is around, the notional time commitment is 2.5 days a month is what we say. But often non-execs will find themselves spending more time than that on the role, because there's such a lot to do, and Dusty might have some views on how that's managed. But generally, you'll find there's a board meeting every month, whether that's a full board meeting held in public, or whether that's some sort of board development event. Obviously, there's some preparation that's required before attending in the board meetings, and generally most non-execs are involved in at least 1 or 2 committees as well as part of their non-executive duties.
Thanks for that, Jess. And just thinking about the package, so being a non-executive director, can we talk about what the package is behind that?
In the remuneration
salary that's drawn from, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So we tend to not use salary because non-execs are not employees of the organisation. It reinforces that external perspective.
That's the word I was trying to avoid. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the word we use is slightly more arcane. Is remuneration, and it depends on the organisation. There are different types of providers. One group's called Foundation Trust, another group called NHS Trust. Dusty's chair of an NHS Trust. Their powers are much more restricted for reasons I won't go into today. If anybody wants to go into that, I'm more than happy to have a conversation offline. But generally, the remuneration for being a non-executive director is between something like 6,000 and probably about 15,000 is the upper edge of that. But whenever a non-executive role is advertised, it should be made clear what the remuneration package is. It's not reflected. It doesn't mean that if you're getting 15,000, it's because it's a more difficult job. I can assure you, being a non-executive director in any NHS provider is a challenging but very rewarding role, and the remuneration isn't a reflection of that in any way.
Good point. And just thinking, I've been told a few times and been advised that often a non-executive role is a good route into a trust as maybe as an executive director or a senior board level position. Have either of you seen that in action? Have you seen that being an effective route into a trust at an executive level?
I think if I may, I've seen the crossover. I've seen the crossover, Peter, happening the other way, where people who are executives on a trust or in a trust can then step into a non-executive role in a different trust. Obviously, I haven't. I'm not sure personally that I would advocate that. If I was to list my reasons for becoming a non-executive, I don't think I would have on that list a stepping stone to taking on an executive role.
Right.
Of course, there is some learning that you could acquire about the NHS, the particular trust, and the challenges it faces. But part of, I suppose, what we're spending our time talking about this evening is that there is a very distinctive and different flavour to the non-executive role, and a non-executive that plays their role well won't necessarily acquire the types of skills that would then position them well to take on an executive appointment. I suspect that the executive appointment would be within their ambit anyway, frankly, if they've come out of the sorts of background that most of the people that are listening to us today have had. Peter, I wonder if I could just make one small ancillary point. I mean, two things that Janice said. The first, when she was asked by you about remuneration, I think we ought to be quite candid about these things. I think the reason that most people that I've ever spoken to want to take on a non-executive role in the NHS is much more around their interest in managing large, complex organisations. And much more in tune with them reaching the stage in their working lives where they actually want to spend time giving, both in the sort of community sense if they're local people, but also simply giving in that sense of sharing the expertise and experience and knowledge they've acquired in their working lives. I've met few, if any, who are interested in taking on the role for the level of remuneration. So I think, although it is remunerated, I would not suggest that the remuneration in any sense reflects the commitment, and that's my second point. The 2.5 days, as Janice absolutely rightly said, is the bit that's written into the contract. But you heard me say earlier about walking the floor. You heard me say earlier about attending committee meetings. Once you begin to total that up, you're much closer to 4 or 5 days a month in reality than you are of 2.5. But for all of that, I think I said earlier this evening that I ran a recruitment campaign when I through the summer. When I joined the trust, I had no female representation on the board on the non-executive side. I had an all-male non-executive board, and I found that was intolerable given some of the sizable maternity units and other things that we manage. I advertised for 2 non-execs to join the trust in August, and at the end of the 2 weeks that the advert had been placed, I had 47 applicants in the long list. And when I wheeled that down to, I think, 15 to create the short list, I was absolutely astounded by the quality of people from completely different types of backgrounds who were stepping up to join. I hasten to add, even out of the 46 in the first place, there wasn't a single person who's coming out of the armed services, though.
Well, that's something maybe we'd look to address moving forward, and actually leads nicely to the next session of what kind of support is available out there to get into a non-executive role. So maybe we could first have a look at the scheme that your team has designed, Janice, around the Flex Non-Executive Director Programme.
Being a full non-executive director isn't necessarily right for everybody at this stage in their development. So we've got a couple of offers there for people to think about whether it's something that might be appropriate for them. The first one is called the Flex Ned. Dusty would be familiar with it. I don't know whether you've got any, Dusty. Have you got any associate directors on your board?
I've got 2.
Yeah. So this is an extension, if you like, of the associate director role, and often what chairs like Dusty use the associate director role as a way of grooming the next batch of non-executive directors for their board. And the FlexNet is an extension of that, where we identify individuals with particular skills that the organisation needs. And I'll use this as an example. I'm not suggesting that necessarily it would work for this particular audience, but many of you will be aware of the problems the NHS had a few months ago with the WannaCry virus and the problems that caused for cancellation of appointments, etc. So the NHS Improvement has asked chairs to think about how they make sure their board has appropriate cybersecurity expertise on their board, around their board table, and ask that a non-executive director provide some support in that area. So, for example, you can envisage the scenario where, if you were a cybersecurity expert, Dusty might approach you to ask you to be considered to take on an associate director role on his board. to provide that kind of expertise. It may not involve doing the full range of non-executive director duties we've talked about. So it's quite a good way for people who've actually got other full-time roles to be able to give something to the NHS, give of their expertise and give of their time without necessarily having to take on the full range of responsibilities that Dusty's described. It is something it's very much a marriage between the individual who's thinking about being a non-executive director or flexible NED in this scenario and the chair. But if it's something that you're interested in, we could certainly explore that.
And just thinking about that, Janice, this flexibility offered through this particular scheme could well fit well with someone who's still serving and has got to balance a lot of other areas, but it could be a very good way of developing that opportunity moving forward. Yeah,
yes, absolutely. It has to be honest, it's not as well so all of those appointments we talked about earlier, it's not as well developed. It's something we've just brought into as part of our portfolio, but it's something we're keen to explore with potential candidates and with chairs if they're that we can find to take on people to help. It's again about helping develop people as well as bringing particular skills and perspectives around the board table.
Brilliant. And the other scheme that you have available is the Next Director scheme?
So the Next Director scheme is specifically something we're targeting to improve the diversity of boards for NHS organisations. The NHS has got a very diverse workforce and we're very proud of that. Unfortunately, not all of our boards reflect that same diversity. So as an example, we found that the non-executive director community is only 37% of the non-executive director community are women, and around 7.7% are from BAME communities, and it's something we need to address to make sure that our boards are as diverse and as have the range of skills and expertise they need. So the Next Director scheme is something specific for people with protected characteristics, either of being a woman or from BAME communities, and it's about trying to help them grow into the non-executive director role. Some people have described it as a board apprenticeship scheme, but I think of it more as being a finishing school for people who are actually very nearly board ready, but just need that final help to make that final step into the boardroom. And it's an introduction to boards and the NHS, or one or the other. It's about placements with providers like Dusty's, where the board offers some mentor support to the individual. The individual gets the opportunity to sit on board meetings and committee meetings and learns the role during this scheme, so that when they are ready to apply for a role, they're in a much better position to make that application and to demonstrate they understand the NHS, understand the language, but also understand how their skills and experience can help the NHS meet the challenges it faces going forward.
Brilliant. And this very much echoes the Step into Health programme that's also running throughout the NHS more at an operational role, and it just demonstrates that the value of actually getting in there and getting involved with trust ahead of time to set yourself up to be considered for a role there. So it's fantastic that you're also running this scheme at a board level as well within the NHS. So maybe I could just put up the final slide there, and then we'll go into some questions and answers of just this pathway into non-executive roles within the NHS, please. If you could just talk through this one quickly, Janice.
Yeah, this just to assure people who are thinking about a non-executive director role and they're not sure how to get involved, how to find their way through to people like Dusty, at which level to pitch themselves. It's basically to provide some reassurance that my team and I are here to help you. And so if the offer is to speak to you as an individually, to help understand what your skills and experience is, so we can try to match you with the right level of opportunity to make sure that we harness the enthusiasm you've got for getting involved in the NHS in the right way. So we've got a talent pool of people that we know are board ready. We can send details to you so you can learn about vacancies and opportunities as they arise. I can arrange local trust introductions to help bridge the gap between where you are now and being a board member, because it can be look like it's a big intimidating step. So obviously having the chance to meet people like Dusty and other non-executive directors can help bridge that gap, and on a practical level provide support and advice to make sure that you make the best of your application to increase your chance of getting through to your local board.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. In which case, we'll just move on to the final slide. So thank you very much for providing that presentation. What we'll do now is, if you have had any questions as we've worked through that from there. So first up, what is the role of a NED against an executive member of the senior leadership team? So essentially, could you explain the difference between a non-executive and an executive is how I read that.
I think that's one for you, Dusty, if you're able to do that.
I'm trying to think of a simple way to explain it. I suppose if I was to use the position of Director of Finance, the Director of Finance might say that there's a particular issue or challenge that he or she is facing, and the response to that is to do A, B, and C. The non-exec sitting across the table, who's got wider experience in finance, because as Janice said earlier, that's one that we pick with great care. That non-exec is likely to say, I understand why you're suggesting that, but have you not thought of E, F, and G, which might be less problematic in the longer term, or might not create a set of issues which we would have difficulty with externally if we were to go down that road or whatever. So the non-executive constantly finds themselves thinking through the long-term outcomes of what is being suggested and playing that role of critical friend. Is that really the best answer? Is that really the best solution going forward? Or actually, is that something which addresses a short-term expedient, which gets us through the week, but actually leaves us off at the end of the financial year in a much worse situation? And I'll give you one example, if I may, just to bring this to life. Yeah. Because Peter, it happened at my own trust in the year before I took office. We were approaching the end of the financial year and the books hadn't balanced. And so someone came up with the idea that we should sell a parcel of land on the hospital site, which was eventually sold, and it had buildings on it which we were still using, which we now became tenants in our own buildings. But the land was sold, the capital receipt was taken in, and the books were balanced. But a year later, that land hasn't been utilised by the people that bought it. We are paying a huge amount of money to remain in the building, and we're now having to make plans to vacate them because the land will be cleared away soon. That was a very poor decision, and it was a particularly poor and ineffective example of non-execs who should have been able to foresee some of that we are now living with, but didn't challenge and allowed something to happen which the executive did because it was expedient and it sorted out the issue at the end of March. That's the kind of example, I think, that I hope brings to life what I'm trying to explain.
Absolutely, really ensuring that accountability there. Oh, understood. No, thank you. The next question is from our friends north of the border. Is there a similar requirement for non-executive directors within Scottish NHSs? Or are we just talking about England and Wales here?
Yeah, NHS Improvement's role does, unfortunately, just does extend as far as Berwick. Anything north of that is responsibility of NHS Scotland, but they do have a similar kind of structure. I understand there are NHS trusts north of the border which will have a similar kind of board arrangement. So you should be able to find out details about how to get involved presumably on the local website.
Yeah, they do. And that's absolutely right. Janice couldn't be more accurate. The primary legislation for much of this actually is enshrined in the same acts, but through devolution, the responsibility is discharged through the Scottish Assembly, but the structures and the governance side of the NHS is broadly analogous to the way that we operate south of the border.
Just as relevant. So everything we've discussed tonight is just as relevant for the Trust North, the board there. Great. Yeah. Returning to more kind of from our audience and where they're coming from here. Is there such a thing as a normal rank range for people transitioning into a non-executive role? Are we talking about colonels or above here, or do you think there's an opportunity for captains to get involved? It'd be good to get your thoughts on that one, Dusty. Of course, translate to RAF.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I think the short answer is that there isn't a direct read across. When I think of some of the people that I've recruited and I've got on my board today, I've got people who are who've been inspectors in the police service, for instance. I've got well, not serving. He's now a retired inspector. That's sort of hitting at the SO1, SO2 mark. I don't. The short answer is no. I don't think there is. I think it's more about the qualities that the individual brings, and I think also there may be a question of timing. In other words, if it was the first thing that someone did as they were leaving the service, it may be slightly more challenging than if it was something that they were doing after they'd been outside the service for 2 or 3 years and had become more tuned with the way that public service and private sector operations run outside of military context. So I think there are a lot of variables here, but I could see people I've known who are very, very competent junior officers and junior senior officers operating just as well as 1 and 2 stars.
Yeah, it's more about experience that you can bring, yeah?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm just talking about experience and how that all fits together. A question about one of the first statements earlier was being a part of the local community. And sometimes as you move around from posting to posting or posted abroad, that can be a bit of a challenge. I mean, how could a service leaver define themselves as being part of the local community? Have you had any thoughts on that, Dusty?
Well, they will.
We're all part of our community, aren't we?
I'd say yes. I mean, I hope at the point in time when someone leaves the service, they will settle in a part of the country that they've chosen to make their home. So in a sense, that becomes their community. There are 2 schools of thought here. I mean, I wouldn't get overly hung up on being a local, within walking distance of your local hospital necessarily. As I said, my first, I live in Westminster in Pimlico. My first non-executive stint was done almost on the, well, it was east of Romford, and I still live in Westminster, and now I'm working in the patch in Enfield. But I don't think that it's an absolute requirement. But having said that, there are some foundation trusts, and there are some trusts where they have written into their constitution that they want people living within 3 miles of the hospital or whatever. So each case will depend on its own set of circumstances. But there is something about having at least 1 or 2 non-executives at the board table who are representative of the local population and who could speak on behalf of that population and whatever particular needs that population has. Because what's really quite interesting is it really doesn't matter what that population is, but when people start to understand population medicine, it becomes very clear that you could take any population and it has its own specific needs and requirements. And so a well-balanced board over time will always have 1 or 2 people who can speak for that community. And I say that in those words carefully, so that I'm not saying that they have to live in that community, but the understanding needs to be there.
understanding of the context there, and it can be learned or lived. Understood.
Yeah.
Understood.
It's also worth just reflecting that some of these organisations actually have huge catchment areas. So, for example, I mentioned I live in Harrogate. The ambulance service that serves my community is called Yorkshire Ambulance Service, which covers, you know, Yorkshire is a huge county. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about areas, you know, being within a small area. And also organisations like Great Ormond Street provide services across the whole of the country. So Dusty's point about checking what the requirements are for an individual role is very important.
Yeah, and you mentioned of Berwick earlier as well, being part of Northumbria Healthcare, which is a huge part of the country to take into account there. So very, very good point there. Maybe I'll just take one more question, because I appreciate we're getting near to the end of our time here. A question for you, maybe Dusty. Is there anything that you've encountered that you find that maybe would put people off the military at the first pass at all?
You mean the NHS?
Yeah, within the NHS, are there any challenges of communicating that skills and experiences into the NHS that you've come across? Misperceptions possibly that need to be addressed? No,
no challenge. So the challenge is the misconception. So there is a point, Peter, you make, which is actually a very valid one, which is that when you present as a candidate for a role, and my comment here is true of roles in any walk of life outside of the military context, there is, particularly if you're just stepping out of uniform, there is, I think, a challenge, which is unwritten and unspoken, that your audience will presume you are a stereotypical military person who barks orders, shouts across the parade square, is largely autocratic, clicks his heels, expects people to salute when they walk into the office door, and stand up when they leave the room. And I know from my own personal experience, in fact, when I went for my very first job when I was interviewed for the Home Office, that it took a lot of convincing that not everyone who was leaving the armed services was of that ilk. And that's the challenge. Now, it's not. I'm slightly overstating it for effect, but it is there. It does linger, and it does need to be addressed positively, either through the way one presents and behaves, so that there can be no doubt that you're not that kind of person, or in some other way. So the answer to your question is I don't think there's anything that's in the context of working in the NHS as a non-executive or any other context, which would be turning off for a military person. In fact, quite the opposite. I think the challenges would immediately be one that a military mind would relate to and would be inspired by. I think the greater challenge is the mistaken belief that all military people have a single identity.
Yes, yes. I'm thinking about that there's a lot of support out there, a lot of resources and network contacts that can actually support you in that area. And I think that's worth highlighting as we kind of complete the session for tonight.
Peter,
please. Yeah, no, go on, please.
No, I'm just missing cutting across you, because actually there is a small little trick here, which is a statement of the obvious.
Okay, well,
do it anyway.
We like tricks. No, go, please.
Try never to present for an interview unless you've had the opportunity to meet informally or speak informally to at least one or two people who are going to be on that interview panel, because there is no better way of presenting your true person, your true nature when you appear at an interview, than having already sown the seeds through an earlier conversation. So that whole thing that I sort of created as a caricature is not even in the minds of the people that are talking to you. So always take advantage of the opportunity. I always offer an opportunity for people to speak to the chair informally, and inevitably the people that are successful at the interview weeks later are the people that took up that opportunity.
Dusty, you stole my thunder, but thank you very much, because it's exactly what I was going to say, is that anyone who's interested in this type of opportunity and taking it forward, Janice is absolutely the person to talk to about this, and absolutely taking advantage of these programs that are available to introduce you into non-executives and chairs out there that you can have conversations with and really put yourself forward. So thank you very much for that Dusty, as well. I will just start to close down for today. Appreciate that we have run over ever so slightly on this one, but as everyone can see, it's a huge opportunity. There's some fantastic roles out there. It's a really good fit for a lot of people out there, and I hope you can see that there are this support mechanism as well. If this is an area that you want to explore further, I would encourage you to talk to Janice and look at some of the programs that are available. So with that piece, I would say thank you very much for tuning into tonight and listening to this. Janice, Dusty, thank you very much for your time, and I know, Dusty, you're recovering at the moment, so thank you very much for soldiering on for a lot longer than an hour than I originally planned, so thank you for that.
Very pleasant, Peter. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everyone for listening.
Yeah, sorry, okay. Peter, can I just tell you, at least 2 of the people that joined us have been in touch already, so that's fantastic. And I'll be in touch with you in the morning, guys. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, there you go. There is an action. So, yeah, thanks very much for that. Yeah, if you just drop across your thoughts on this, I've just put up on the end of the presentation the contact details again. Yeah, if you'd like to explore this further, please get in touch with Janice, get in touch with the Officers Association, and we will do what we can to support you. In which case, I'll say thank you very much for this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.